Chapter, what do we got? 9, Finding True Love. Oh, I love this one. I met my darling Pat in a little pizzeria in Missoula, Montana on the evening of Thursday, September 1st, 1983. Now let me give you the backstory. I was in my second year of teaching at the Post-Secondary Vocational Center in Missoula, Montana in the late summer of 1983. The fall semester had just begun. I remember my assigned curriculum was industrial math, automotive transmission, introduction to machine tools, and hydraulics. I loved teaching because it involved so much interaction with young people figuring out their futures. I remember one young man in a couple of my classes, Scott Bradshaw, whom I interacted quite a bit with, eventually convincing him that he needed to serve a full-time mission, after which he would have a better understanding of what career path he should take. He followed my advice and even invited me to a sacrament meeting talk where he told his word about me and our relationship. It was very meaningful to me, probably because of my love for the Book of Mormon. All the fall quarter moved along. It became very difficult for me to focus on my teaching. I had just gone through what I call a surprise divorce. A few months prior, my wife had taken me aside one afternoon on Father's Day, June 19th, 1983, and told me that she didn't love me anymore and wanted a divorce. My world was upside down, and I could not get it turned back right side up. I remember the secretaries in the office all had someone they wanted me to meet, which I declined. I wasn't interested in dating, and though I was only 31 at the time, and I knew I eventually would find someone to remarry, I was consumed with missing my 3 children that had been taken to Wyoming by my ex-wife. Life has never been that hard since. It was an awful time. To this day, I learned to hate divorce for what it does to children. It's pure selfishness. I had a close friend, Steve Atkin, who also worked at the vocational college as director of the resource center. As it turned out, my very close brother, Gar, was also very close to Steve Atkin. I had no idea at the time, but they were both convinced that the perfect girl to date for me was Patricia McClellan, who lived in Missoula, Montana. They had one big concern, however. She had 7 children. She was also a widow from her husband committing suicide in January of 1982. He had a history of unfaithfulness, child abuse, drug use, and pornography. She had had a hard life to date. She had dated a little, but was very picky. She would often tell people that there were worse things than being single. So in reflecting on that time, I can say that Steve and Gar started to slowly build her up to me. I remember having a conversation with Steve one afternoon in his office and informing him that I had no interest in dating the General Relief Society president of the church. He laughed and began realizing what he had been doing. I later realized that everyone he had told me about her, everything he had told me about her was true. She is an amazing person. I laughed to myself still when I remember how they tiptoed around the number of children she had. They were so concerned that it would scare me off. Gar's strategy was to tell me always about how wonderful her kids were and how obedient they were and much more. He later told me how interested he was in her, but felt he didn't have the capacity to take on 7 children at once. Honestly, for some reason, the number of children never once concerned me. I was much more interested in just her, but didn't want to jump into a relationship at the time. I was more concerned with that aspect than anything else, and was not sure if she would be interested in me at all. I learned later that Steve was building me up to her beyond who I considered myself to be as a person. I remember the day that I finally told Steve that the number of children she had was not an issue at all, and that I was only concerned about who she was as a person and if she was interested in me. With that backstory, let me now write about how we met and when I knew I wanted to marry her. Steve had high council meetings every Thursday evening, which made his plan very doable. He was going to do a threesome date to the Zimmerino's Pizzeria on the night of his church meeting, Thursday, September 1st, 1983. His plan was to eat quickly and then excuse himself for his meetings before asking me if I could give Pat a ride back home when he was done eating. Clever. Sorry, that's me. Clever. I knew nothing of this at the time, but looking back, it really was perfect. It was all set. I was to meet them at 7 p.m. I remember how nervous I was as I drove there. At that moment, I really wasn't excited about any of this and just wanted to go back to my apartment. As I walked into the pizzeria, I nervously scanned the dimly lit place for Steve's face at one of the tables. Suddenly, it was just right in front of me. I looked away from him to the girl he was seated by and thought, oh my gosh, she is beautiful. She won't be interested in me. I also noticed as I reached out to shake her hand that she had both hands under the table. I learned later that she was wiping her hands on her pant legs, trying to dry off her nervous, sweaty palms. We ordered my favorite pizza, double cheese with garlic. To this day, it is still our favorite. After Steve left us, we sat and talked for another hour and a half. As I drove up to Pat's house, to my pleasant surprise, there were 7 kids with their noses pressed up against the front living room window, wondering who this man was that was bringing their mother home. I went in with her to meet all the children. I still remember thinking how right Gar was. They really were wonderful kids. It is still a tender memory for me. Me too, Dad. Note from Pat. What Brad didn't know was that I had told my children before I left for the date that I was going to meet their new father. That's why they had their noses pressed up against the window. The following day, my thoughts were all over the map. Now, years later, I can see why. I was still an emotional mess over missing my children and confused on what might lay ahead. However, I was suddenly captivated by this beautiful woman and her life. Steve invited both of us to St. Ignatius for Labor Day weekend. Pat and her family stayed with the Atkins, and I stayed with at my home place. That weekend was filled with so many memories and events. Saturday, we spent time up in the fields on the side of the mountain where Steve and Penny were building their new house. Sunday, we were in church together and then back up to the same place to roast marshmallows. I remember sitting by Pat in the field with the kids all playing together. Our hands were both supporting us as we sat next to each other watching the kids. Suddenly, I put my pinky over her top of hers. She left it there, and in my mind, that meant that we were moving forward in this relationship. I still laugh at this memory. That night, we decided to walk together down from the hills and back into Mission and the Atkins place. Things really took off at that point. Later that evening, I kissed her for the first time, and the next night asked her if she would have another child. That was so important to me. I knew right then and there that she was the one, and the thought of having her slip away I knew right then and there she was the one, and the thought of having her slip away had crossed my mind. She said yes to the question of having another child, and then I asked her to marry me. We spent every spare hour together from then on until the wedding night on Wednesday, the 19th of October, 1983. Many years have passed. In October 2023, it was 40 years. I could never adequately describe the journey together. We are one person in every way, but most importantly in Christ. And as an important side note, the romance has never gone away or even diminished in all these years. It has grown. She is my eternal everything. That's a nice way to say it. My darling. And there's Mom and Dad looking awesome. That's it.